Well, with the holiday season approaching, churches and individuals across the U.S. and around the world will be turning their attention often to missions and mission opportunities. One of the key things about that is knowing the best way to engage in missions, especially this time of year, because there are so many options. And you want to make sure that the choices you're making about the kinds of missions and mission activity you get involved with are the best way to get involved and most productive and beneficial for those who are receiving the help that you're interested in. Elli Oswald is the executive director of the Faith to Action Initiative. She's also served as a director of missions and outreach at a local church in Seattle, where she guided them to various ministries to the poor and vulnerable, both in Seattle and around the world. And she's even been part of the Children in Crisis research team tied to World Vision. So she's got a breadth of experience from local to national to international. We're excited to have Elli with us today. Elli, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Colin. It's fun to be here with you.
Tell us a little bit about Faith to Action Initiative, maybe a high-level view of it.
Yeah, so Faith to Action works to actually educate Christians, so churches, faith-based organizations or individuals like you and I, around what's working best to care for and support orphaned and vulnerable children around the world. So simply put, this best practice is really around supporting family-based care options for orphaned and vulnerable children. We believe at the end of the day, children need families. In fact, we believe it's God's intention for children to be able to find safe and loving family. And that safe and loving family is the most important source of belonging, of identity, the emotional and mental and physical support that children need to be able to thrive. What's really unique about Faith to Action is that we are actually a coalition of organizations. So we're a collection of Christian organizations that has been coming together for 17 years now. I had to do my math before I got on to promote best practices in orphan care. So what that means is we focus on helping others do their very best work to support these kids, whether that is the way we're directing our donations or planning our mission trips, or if you're working directly with children and families around the world. So it really is a pleasure to be part of this larger coalition of organizations working together on this.
That's awesome. We're going to come back to specifically some of those needs related to families, why maybe some of those best practices have changed over time and what we find are most effective right now. I want to come back for just a moment, though, to your story. Talk for a moment about your journey to faith and how you got involved in missions in the first place.
Well, I was raised in a wonderful Christian family, and I feel incredibly thankful, grateful, and privileged to be able to say that. My personality, even at a young age, was kind of a do-gooder. It's just I wanted to be a part of something that made an impact in the world, even as a young kid. So my parents really fostered opportunities for me to be a part of fundraisers at school. By the time I was in high school, I was organizing service days and fundraisers. And I was even I was a student representative on the local Habitat for Humanity board in my town. And that fostered just a desire to use my life in a way that was serving others. It was just so fulfilling and really drove the decisions I made as I looked at my career. So I studied nonprofit work and ministry and church ministry in college and in grad school, went to Fuller Seminary, studied cross-cultural engagement and missions work, and started out at World Vision, as you mentioned in my bio, which was, I was just thrown in the deep end in a team that was really focused on kind of technically figuring out what kind of programming is working best to help the most vulnerable children in the world. So sometimes you can do programs and they help the kids that are kind of doing all right, but need a little help. But we really were looking at the most kind of desperate situations. Specifically, my job was to look at children who had been separated from their parents. So working with incredible organizations around the world as a representative of Faith of World Vision, doing that work, lots of travel, learning from our partners about what's working, what's not working, piloting new programs. Such an incredible time of learning for me. But God was working on me because I started to kind of poo-poo the U.S. church. I kind of started to think the U.S. church they just want to do things that make them feel better and they don't really want to do a good work. And then God was like, actually, you're going to be a missions pastor at a local church. That's the short, I could tell the whole story, but really brought me to a place of humility and then empowered me to see that it really is the church that can do this work, only the church that can do this work to see true transformation of families and lives and communities. So I worked as a missions pastor at a wonderful church called Bethany Community Church in Seattle, Washington, and was continuing to work in the global mission space. And when I had my second son, I stepped out of that position, and Faith to Action, who I'd actually engaged with since my time at World Vision as a volunteer, asked me to come on staff. So that was 9-ish years ago. And I've been working with Faith to Action ever since then. And what I love about Faith to Action for my own story is we work in knowing the technical stuff. We want to know what's working best for kids. And that often means reading the research and joining the millions of webinars and connecting with these global institutions like UNICEF and World Vision and Save the Children, and these people that are really learning and researching, and connecting that to just Christians who want to do good and helping that information be accessible and sharing learning back and forth. And that's what Faith to Action is all about. And I love being a part of it.
I want to go back through a little bit of your career and talk about maybe some of your learnings. One of the things I love about this program is the ability for all of us to learn from the situations that God has put us in. And obviously, right off the bat, with an incredible worldwide organization like World Vision, it had to be like drinking from a fire hose. Talk for a moment about that experience and maybe a thing or two you learned specifically during your time at World Vision that began to shape your thoughts and perceptions of ministry.
Well, probably the smartest thing my boss did was put me on a big research project as one of my very first things to do. And the research included not only a thorough look at all the existing research, but also interviews with about 25 individuals that were working in the care specifically of children who had been separated from their families, or what we often think of as orphaned children. So I got to interview people all over the world, visit programming and learn about it. And I'm so thankful for that, because if I would have had to come in and do the work that I needed to do without having this incredible opportunity to learn and research, and I mean dig in, it was days and days, months and months of really digging in to say, what have we learned in this space? And it's been foundational for me since then to know that this is based on research. I think one of the things that most people don't realize is there are millions of children around the world that live in orphanages. The current estimates are low, but they say 5 million children today are in an orphanage. We know that number is too low because most children aren't legally registered in the system, so we don't know exactly. And what we would assume is most of these children are orphans, right? Their families are passed away, their parents are passed away. But what research has shown over and over in the years is that the vast majority of them actually have a living parent. So 80% have a living parent. Many of those could potentially care for their children if they were given support to do so. Children who don't have parents who can care for them, especially if their parents are unsafe for them, they often have extended family who can do that. And in some of these countries around the world, extended family is very extended, right? Like you have hundreds of aunties and uncles in these communities around the world, where maybe in our own culture, it's just a few. So there's options and opportunity for children to be cared for in family through that. And then for children who really can't be in their biological families, local foster care is actually happening and local adoptions are happening. And we have examples of that. Those were the partners I got to research and learn about and ask, like, is this really working? And what is happening? And how are they doing it? At the end of the day, what I learned is that all families need support to care for their children. No one lives independently. We all live dependent on one another. And how can we invest in communities and in families to be able to care better for their children, whether they're extremely poor or they're, in a situation where they can physically provide for their families, but all families have times where they need support. And so we talk a lot about family strengthening, helping families to care well for their children. And that's really been foundational for me as I've moved forward in my career.
Such an important point, and thank you for bringing up the piece about these children and the term orphan, because in early part of my career, I worked with different ministries that dealt with orphans, and my thought was always they've lost their parents. These poor children, they have no parents. More and more today, I'm hearing of parents who've literally given their children over to orphanages because there's food to feed four and they have six in the family and they have to choose which two go to the orphanage just so they can continue to feed their kids. So it's still heartbreaking, but it's a very different picture of what the possibilities might be for working with those children and those families. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's something many in the West specifically don't understand about the term orphan today and the way that it's used. Let's move for a moment to your time at mission and outreach at Bethany Community Church in Seattle. Here you said yourself, I'm not sure the Christian church in the U.S. really knows what's going on. They need some help. And God says, I'm going to put you in a local church and you're going to help figure it out. So talk for a minute about that transition, that process, and maybe a couple of things you learned moving to a local church.
Yeah. What I found and what overwhelmed me the entire time and still overwhelms me is that there are people who sacrifice their entire lives, whether that is through service, through giving, just incredible generosity and sacrifice to serve the most vulnerable around the world. And what I believe is, and what I believe I've discovered is that those type of people, when they know better, they do better. So it's about knowledge and learning and not oversimplifying things, but dealing with complexity and having space for learning that can really help those of us, you and I in the US, who want to serve, be aligned with what's being found to work best on the ground. And that's just been so encouraging. The church, at least that I was a part of at Bethany, was willing to read books with me and talk about them and dialogue and go, oh, wow, this is what I thought. Like you said, I just assumed that a kid in an orphanage doesn't have parents. I'm learning. Let's have another conversation. And also what I saw was incredible global partners who were willing to not only do the work that they're doing on the ground to serve families and communities and address root causes of the poverty and challenges that families were facing in those communities. Not only were they doing that work, but they were willing to disciple us as the U.S. church to come along and say, yes, we of course appreciate your funding, but we want to journey with us in what we're learning. And maybe you'll learn some things about your ministry there in Seattle. World Relief was one of those that just really takes serious this idea of church empowerment. So they're empowering the local church. We were working with them in Rwanda. That was incredible to see. And then it convicted our church so much that we created what they called an empowerment zone, where we brought together local churches in our neighborhood to go, what can we do about the homelessness issue in our neighborhood in Seattle? And just incredible opportunities to have cross-cultural learning. And all of it is rooted not in pride, but in a desire to be a part of God's good work and knowing the value of that good work and that it's not our work, that it's God's. And it's really an exciting adventure to be a part of that work. And that can only happen in the church.
When you got to the church in Seattle, did they already have a well-established missions ministry, or were you part of building or growing the ministry?
It was one of those churches that had grown really rapidly in the previous years. So I would say we had taken a grassroots approach. If anybody wants to start anything, just start it. And so we had a ton of things happening, but there wasn't really any rhyme or reason. And a lot of those ministries were feeling like, well, why don't I get an announcement? Or I haven't talked to a pastor lately, and they were feeling neglected. So we really got together to say, what is the role that our church is serving? How do we ensure that those ministries are aligned with that, and how do we support those efforts to continue to move forward? So there was a lot going on, but it needed some thinking, I would say, and some strategy behind it. And people were very open to doing that. Like I said, when they know better, they do better. And they were really willing to journey with me in that process.
Talk about your transition to faith to action. You said you had come home to have a baby, and the opportunity opened up? How did that take place? And what did you find as you began to work with Faith in Action related to what God was doing there?
Yeah. So I actually started when I worked for World Vision. World Vision is one of the founding members of Faith to Action. And so when I was working for World Vision, I started working with Faith to Action as one of their leadership council members, which is just a volunteer position that these organizations are part of. So I was volunteering and helping them create resources and just giving input and also sharing their resources. When I went to the church, I actually stayed on because, again, one of the most important audiences of Faith to Action's work is the church. And so was able to do that. So by the time they offered me a position, I was already incredibly passionate about the work to inform people about the importance of family for children, and was able to just step in because it was very clear to me that God had prepared me for this position. Eventually, it started out 10 hours a week at 6 months contract, and somehow I'm now the full-time executive director. So that's just kept rolling with it.
That's great. That's great. Talk. Let's go ahead and talk now about this family piece that you mentioned a couple of times. The fact that it's not just about helping the orphan, helping the child in an orphanage or in a facility, but it's really about much of the new activity is around helping the family. What does that mean? What does that look like, especially if I'm somebody thinking about helping a ministry activity going on halfway around the world that I can't monitor? What does that look like? What do I need to be looking for?
Yeah. Well, I think something interesting, if I can get a little geeky on the Bible, is
Sure.
the mandate to care for the orphan is all over Scripture, and I call it a mandate because it's articulated that way in Scripture. It's an important part of our discipleship as Christians. But what some of the biblical scholars have kind of recognized that orphan and widow are almost always together, presented together in those passages in the scripture. And the scholars have suggested that perhaps these two categories of vulnerable people, orphans and widows, would have been understood by the original readers or the original hearers of the scripture to be one unit. So essentially, it could be talking about a single mother family or a single father family. These families were without a father, or this is where the term fatherless comes in. Without a father, those families were incredibly vulnerable in that society. So it's just interesting because I think we've defined this idea of orphan care very specifically. Often when we think of orphan ministries for church or otherwise, it would either include international adoption or international adoption at an orphanage. That's kind of what we assume. But when you start to think about potentially this could mean something even more, we separate out the orphan ministry and the widow's ministry in our church, but this could potentially be also calling us to caring for that family unit, which I think is really interesting. We need to expand our idea of what orphan care or orphan ministry means. And really, orphan care is anything that helps ensure a child who's been separated from their family for whatever reason, or maybe is at risk of being separated from their family, making sure that they can be well cared for in a safe and loving family. So really expanding our view of what that means to respond to that biblical mandate. So for example, for one family, it could mean something like supporting savings groups, which are places where very poor families can come together, pool their resources, they learn about savings, and they go out and utilize that for things that will help build their resilience so that they can be in a more stable place to care for their children. It might look like increasing access to schools. Getting kids education is one of the main reasons that children end up in orphanages, and actually helping children access schools with their families, living with their family, is an incredibly important thing to help children be able to stay in a loving family. Another example might be inclusion of children with disabilities. So disabilities make up a huge percentage of children who are separated from their families. Families are overwhelmed and not sure how to care well for these children. So raising awareness about the value of these children, especially through the church, addressing some of those cultural stigmas that we know exist that have caused these children to be isolated and thrown out of their families, and then actually supporting families who have children with disabilities or parents with disabilities to be able to care for them. And there's a group called Akisa in Uganda that they're awesome. Just you can Google them and see they do both of those things, raise awareness and support families. But that kind of work is happening all over. One of my favorite things is empowering the local church. The local church are like perfectly placed to notice when a family's struggling. Often the reason that children are separated from their families is not because their families members have died, but their family is poor and they're struggling. Some crisis has happened in their family and they're struggling to care for them. So they see like an orphanage as an option, or they move to the streets. And so the local church can go, uh-oh, this family who I know is already struggling, their dad just lost their job or left them, or there's sickness in their family. What can we do to wrap around them? And it's really what I like to call the first responders to vulnerable families. But also supporting foster care and adoption to grow in these countries around the world is an incredible way to do this work. So it's really about kind of being creative and expanding our thoughts about what it means to be a part of work that's serving the orphaned around the world.
So, Ellie, as we understand more and more about what those needs are and how best to serve orphans and widows and families that are in these situations, you could go online and type in, opportunities to give at Christmas, or if maybe through your church, there's all kind of mission things talked about. How in the world, with the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mission agencies, each doing their kind of little piece, how do you find those that are doing most effectively what you're talking about and in serving the entire family through the local church and not just dropping off some gifts at a local orphanage?
Well, it is tough. And I think that it does mean being an educated donor, which for your listeners, look, they've already started their journey of education around the importance of family-based care for kids. But finding an organization that aligns with your values and your interests is really important. We are not the solution, but we do on our website, because we have so many people that challenge with this faith to action. We have a section of stories. And so we share, I think it's like 90 stories of 90 different organizations around the world that are doing family-based care. So if you're in a hurry, you want to find a vetted organization that you can support this holiday season, that's a great resource. Just on our very front homepage, scroll down and you'll find a map. You can actually, if there's a country that you've been to, or maybe you have an interest in, you can look at that country and see what partners are there already. But yeah, taking a good look at someone's website and noticing words around strengthening families and supporting communities is really important. The reality is the term orphan sells, and it will be very clear if someone's not supporting families. It's pretty clear on a website, but U.S. Christians specifically have a significant role to play. We're some of the most generous people in the entire world. In fact, there was a study with the Barna Group that found that U.S. Christian individuals, not churches, not foundations, just individuals, give $2.5 billion a year to residential programs, so orphanages and children's homes. And what incredible generosity. It's an industry like in itself. It's a huge amount of money. And it also just shows the impact that our little $30 here, $100 here donation makes together. And as we continue to learn and grow and journey, we can expand the options for these children so that when their family's in crisis, the orphanage isn't the only place that they can take them. They know there's options around strengthening their families, or maybe there's a foster care situation that those families can rely on when they're in struggle. So we have an incredible opportunity to get around some of these ministries. It truly is a global movement. There's been a lot of change in the last 20 years, and we're seeing more and more organizations, governments, individuals step up and be a part of changing the way we care for orphaned and vulnerable children.
Well, we'll be sure to link people to your organization and let them be able to look through those lists as we head into the Christmas season. Many people already looking for opportunities with their families to participate in this type of activity. So thank you for helping educate us. And I assume there's also resources there to continue to learn either ourselves or local churches to learn more about what the needs are. And again, we'll direct people to that in our podcast and program notes. Elli, thanks so much for being with us today. It's great to have you. Blessings in your work, and a Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Thank you so much.